at Meisel Field. So I have asked Jim Johnson, who's from Birdsall, to be here tonight to answer some of the, frankly, the accusations that were made last week by this former employee. So Jim, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Freeholder Chairman. I would just like to, and most of the allegations that I heard were third hand, so rather than try to refute point by point what was alleged, what I would like to do is provide some contextual history of the project and address the issue of someone questioning the efficacy and or the appropriateness of what was done out at Meisel. As a number of you are aware who were on the Freeholder board at the time, the whole Meisel Park project started as a result of an underground storage tank that had been removed by the clubhouse. The tank had leaked, and some of the subsequent investigation revealed some fairly significant soil contamination of metals in the general field area. PMK at the time was brought on board to take a look at the contamination. At that point, the field was closed due to the potential health risk to anybody playing in that field, appropriately so. So we had engaged in an investigative process to assess the extent of the contamination, potentially look for sources of contamination, ultimately see if there's any potential responsible parties who could be associated with that contamination. So over the course of an investigation, we determined that the contamination was pretty well located within the field area. We had worked very, very closely at that point with the DEP, who had been put on notice because of the original underground storage tank leak. So there was a case number for the site. So we very quickly had DEP involvement in the soil issue. We did a number of investigations, as I indicated. We determined the extent of the contamination and basically came to this Freeholder board at the time with 4 potential alternatives for remediation. Number 1 was the do-nothing remediation, which potentially at that time was acceptable, which was to put a fence around the entire field, the contaminated area, put up signs and leave it as a brownfield. Number 2 was we approached the DEP about a blending alternative, since the contamination was roughly 1 to 1.5 foot below grade. An emerging technology at that time was blending, which is now acceptable, but at the time the DEP was not comfortable with it. The third alternative was potentially capping the soil on site with 2 foot of clean fill. That was complicated by the fact that all of you who know that area know that it's in a flood hazard area, so putting 2 foot of fill in a flood hazard area is very, very difficult to get permitted through the DEP. So lastly, the remedial alternative of choice was excavation and removal of that material, which was ultimately done. This Freeholder board at the time was very concerned about making sure that the appropriate thing was done. In my opinion, the appropriate solution was selected, which was the excavation and removal, which was done under the direct guidance of the DEP. There was a contractor hired to excavate, remove, and dispose of that soil. That soil went through a manifest process to acceptable facilities both in Pennsylvania and in Staten Island, and we have the receipts of all that. Ultimately, we put together a final report for DEP and closed out the soil portion of that remediation. We also had the groundwater issue that had emerged as a result of the underground storage tank, and the complexing issue there, for those who were there at the time remember, was that the county parks had bought this site from a chemical factory back in the 1930s. So the DEP looks at the current owner as the potential responsible party until such time you can show that somebody else caused that contamination. So over the course of approximately 4 to 5 years, a series of groundwater investigations were performed in order to show the DEP that the contamination that was existing at the site was not the result of Springfield's operation of the property or anybody else's operation of the property. So ultimately, and we're right now in front of the DEP for an NFA on the groundwater issue, which one may say took a long period of time. However, at the time, the county engineer, Jeff Sias, had made the decision appropriately so that since the DEP was not necessarily pushing us because they recognized that it was most likely not the county's issue, that we should take not be proactive on the groundwater, but work with the DEP as they gave us direction one way or the other to go ahead and follow their direction to get the final closure, which we anticipate will happen very quickly. So ultimately, I wanted to mollify any concerns that this freeholder board may have relative to the appropriateness and the efficacy of the remediation that was done out there. Everything was done appropriately in accordance with DEP regulations. Ultimately, I did hear that there was some allegation that some of the soil may have ended up in another location. We had manifests for every truckload of soil that went off that site. It was signed by the person who, when it left the site and when it was brought to a disposal facility. So as your consultant at the time, I am 100% comfortable that what was done there was appropriate. If there is, or was at the time, any concern that soil that was known to be contaminated was ending up at some other location where it could be exposed to other residents, certainly the alleger at that point should have and had really the obligation to notify us and or the appropriate authorities, and not doing so and knowing that that was the case certainly makes that somebody potentially complicit in an illegal activity, which we certainly were not aware of, and to this point have never gotten any additional information in that regard. So I really think it's appropriate and important for this freeholder board to recognize that, in my opinion, at least at the time, the freeholders made the appropriate decision on how to proceed. The cost was fairly significant, and I remember standing in front of the freeholder board and being grilled on, Jim, is this really the best way to go? It's a lot of money, and I think the freeholders made the appropriate decision at that time and still believe that to be the case, and I'm 100% comfortable that the work that was done was appropriate, necessary, in accordance with DEP regulations. So that's one piece of it. There's a second part, which I know is not necessarily germane to the freeholders that are sitting here now. However, since it was raised by the same person in a public forum, there's an allegation of some sort that PMK, which is a predecessor of Birdsall Services Group that ultimately merged, used this project as a way to somehow enhance the value of its company prior to a merger, and that is both patently false and extremely offensive to me, because not only is it fraudulent to do that, it is also, the timeframes were so much different. This project occurred for the most part in 2003, and I merged my company in 2008. So I want to at least get on the public record that that clearly was not the case, and the Meisel Park project had zero to do with the value and merger of PMK into Birdsall Services Group. And finally, also, there was, I heard third hand, and again, I did say I didn't want to refute allegations one by one, but this is also important to me, that somehow or another Birdsall Services Group and Lewis Berger Associates are somehow related or merged or anything. The freeholders know very, very clearly that Birdsall Services Group has no relationship professionally and or otherwise with Lewis Berger Associates. So with that, I'm certainly willing to answer any other questions that you may have on this, but I wanted to make sure that this freeholder board is comfortable that the work that is done at the time is appropriate. Any questions at all?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the review, but I remember it very well sitting here and going through this, and I remember being frustrated only for the fact that we had to close Meisel Park to begin with, and that the kids and anybody using that park couldn't use it for several years. But I was convinced at that time, and I am now, that the right thing was done. And at the best decision at the lowest cost to the county residents was made, and for the safety of people using that park. We're talking about kids and playgrounds and ball fields, and we took a very cautious approach, took the advice of our experts with the information given. And, I stand by the decisions I made. I appreciate the review of history and how it happened. That's how I remember it as well. And I continue, Mr. Chairman, to ride past that and see it open and people playing there. And I'm happy that we were able to be in a position to do the right thing and in the safest manner for the residents. So that's how I remember it very well. And it was a good decision then. It's a good decision now.
And I certainly support that. And one of the other things that I think was also raised, and it was certainly discussed at the time, as Freeholder Mirabello will recall, was the issue of potentially going after other responsible parties for cost recovery. And because what we're dealing with is a defunct chemical factory that was out of there for, at that point, 60-plus years. It was our recommendation at the time that you would spend a lot of money, both legal and engineering-wise, to chase a rabbit down a hole that ultimately you probably wouldn't have a likelihood of success with. However, we did work with the Freeholder Board to secure approximately $750,000 of grant money to help offset the cost there. So certainly, I remember very well both the grilling on the cost, but also, hey, Jim, isn't there any way we can get some money here? And, you know, it probably feels good to say, let's go get the person who caused this. However, the practicality at that point wasn't reasonable. And I would think that the taxpayers of Union County would be more upset if we spent good money after bad trying to chase something that didn't have a great likelihood of success.
Vice Chair.
Jim, thanks for the presentation. I appreciate the update, but the review of what happened. And I recall clearly when the gentleman, I think he was from Springfield, actually came before the board and said, there's a problem with this property that you don't know about. And I know that we were all surprised by that, and you certainly were able to take care of the problem and address it. And it's a fabulous park, and I ride by it all the time too, and I see people using it, and it's just fabulous. He did mention something about cleaning firms, dry cleaning firms, and I don't believe that was what it was. Is that correct? It was.
Well, Freeholder, the contaminants in the groundwater, PC and TC, are traditionally dry cleaning solvents. So one of the things that we have done, and we believe successfully so, at least indicated that the contaminants weren't emanating from our use of the site. Potentially, there could be a dry cleaner, and one was identified. However, the data didn't support blaming that particular location as a source. We believe it's, you know, there's multiple causes of why there's some groundwater contamination on that site. However, at this point, the DEP takes over the investigation process of where it's coming from. We extract the county from that, spending money, and it could well be some other source that has not been identified. However, it's now the DEP's issue. We've now proven to them that it clearly wasn't from either our operation or what we bought when the county parks purchased the property some 60 years ago, or at that point 60 years ago.
Okay, so we've cleaned it up, and now they're taking it over the investigation of it. Is that what?
Well, what we've done, Freeholder, is we've proven to them that our activities are not the cause of the contamination. There is still contamination in the groundwater at levels above standards. The DEP then takes over the process now to determine whether or not any remediation is necessary, probably not, and to see if they want to pursue anybody in the area and spend state money to try to track down sources. What the county did have the obligation to make sure was that there wasn't a continuing source on our site that was continuing to feed this situation, and we've now confirmed that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the Freeholder? And Jim, the one final point I want to make is the decisions that we made were also made in consultation with the officials in Springfield, who wanted that site remediated to the highest standards, because that site's unique in the sense that field there is used for the Dayton High School, which is located in Springfield, which is exactly like United. That's where they play their football games and soccer games and a lot of the activities there. So they were in complete agreement as to the determination to remediate it the way it was done. So just wanted to put that on the record as well. Jim, thank you for
Thank you for your time and indulgence.
Thank you.